In this example, you are given a function and they want you to figure out the maximums and minimums of the function using your derivative. It first asks you to figure out where is it increasing and decreasing, and then using this information, you find your maximums and minimums. So remember, the derivative tells you about the slope. And so if I get a positive derivative, that tells me I'm increasing. If I have a negative derivative, that tells me that the function is decreasing. And if the derivative equals 0, then that tells me that the function is constant in that interval. So let's start by finding our derivative, and then we can decide whether it's positive, negative, or constant, or 0. So my derivative would be 12x cubed minus 12x squared minus 24x. So we've got our derivative. And then what you need to do is factor it. So first look for what does the function have in common. So they all have a 12 and they all have an x. So we're going to factor out a 12x. Then we want to factor this trinomial. So we're looking for numbers that multiply to make -2, but add up to -1. So we've got x minus 2, x plus 1. And so this is my derivative in factored form. And what I like to do is make a table of values. Before we make the table, we need to figure out what our critical numbers are. So we're going to set our derivative equal to 0, which gives me 0 for one critical number, 2, and -1 for the other one. And we're going to take these critical numbers and create intervals out of them. So my smallest number is -1. So the first interval of the function would be -infinity to -1. And then -1 to 0 is the next biggest number. And then we've got 0 to 2 would be the next largest number. And then we've got 2 to infinity. So something happens at -1, 0, and 2. And so those are our critical numbers. And then we make intervals out of them. So there's 4 intervals. And so we're going to make a table. And so these are my intervals. And here for the columns, we're going to put our factors of the derivative. So we've got 12x, x minus 2, and x plus 1. And then what we're going to do is multiply them together to make f prime. Okay, so 12x. What we're going to do is test numbers in the interval to figure out whether this factor is positive or negative. So if I test something between -infinity and -1, say -10, that would make this negative. If I test something between -1 and 0, like -1/2, that's going to be negative. If I test a number between 0 and 2, say 1, that's positive. And if I test a number between 2 and infinity, say +10, that would be positive. And now let's do this factor. So if I try -10, this will be negative. If I try -1/2, this will be negative. If I try 1, this will be negative. And if I try 10, that would be positive. Then here, this factor, if I try -10, it would be negative. If I try -1/2, it would be positive. If I try 1, it would be positive. And if I try 10, it would be positive. And now we have our derivative, which we take all 3 factors and multiply them. So we've got a negative times a negative times a negative would be negative. A negative times a negative times a positive would be positive. A positive times a negative times a positive would be negative. And a positive, positive, positive would be positive. And then Sorry, I keep getting notifications. Then we say here, we look over here, if the derivative is less than 0, so negative, it's decreasing. If the derivative is greater than 0, it's increasing. So we know what the function is doing on these intervals. So we've got decreasing, increasing, decreasing, increasing. So that was the first part of the problem. So this interval is decreasing, that interval is increasing, and so on. The next part of the problem is asking for where are the maximums and minimums. So let's look at our x-axis or